Awesome. How you guys doing? Man, this is awesome, awesome, awesome. I hope you've enjoyed the conference a lot. How many people had a good time so far? That is great. That is awesome. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Personally, I've been kind of in and out because while my boss has been sitting over here hanging out, hobnobbing with all kinds of good folks, somebody has to keep this church running. So I hope you guys had a good time because my boss had me working this whole time. No, I'm just kidding, actually. In fact, that's actually what I want to talk about is the joy that it is to be not the guy, but the guy standing next to the guy. I'll talk about that in a moment. You know, for me, this is an exciting conference because I started out in the business world. Many of you who, if you go to Crossroads, know this. I worked at P&G for 10 years and loved my time at Procter & Gamble. It was a great company for me, and yet I left to come to Crossroads for two very specific reasons. One was I absolutely felt called to this place, and I still do every day, feel called to what God is doing right here in this community. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else than right here. And the second reason is because of the passion of this place that fuels me. But the greatest surprise for me has been how awesome it's been to grow in leadership and, quite frankly, in my entrepreneurial abilities because I'm not the guy. Because I get to work for an incredible leader. Brian Tome is an incredible leader. I love leading under him. And I want to talk to people in the room today who are kind of in that space. And this might sound like a really interesting talk to have with a bunch of people who want to be their own boss. How many people want to be their own boss in here? Just by show of hands. There's quite a few hands. Now, how many people like me are on a team where there's a visionary leader and you're running after some big stuff and you recognize, you know what, I don't have to be the CEO, but I play a critical role in the team. How many people are there in the room like that? Awesome. I want to talk to you. And what I want to talk to you about are lessons I've learned from the second chair. I use that term because of a book that really helped shape for me how to think about this. It's called Leading from the Second Chair. Leading from the second chair. And it's the idea of, you know, you might be on a team, there might be people on your team who are leaders, and yet everybody's not called to lead. And that's what I want you to hear today very clearly. Every great endeavor, every great entrepreneurial effort that you could think of, all the things that are happening in this room, if they come alive, it will be a team effort. Am I right? It'll be a team effort. And not everybody has to lead the team. And so if you are a leader in here, if you're a CEO, I hope that you hear in this an invitation to create an environment where you empower people and do what Marcus Buckingham said in his book, create heroes in every role. There's an opportunity to create heroes in every role. So to do that, I'm going to talk a lot about just my personal experience of leading at Crossroads and actually leading with Brian and feeling a part of a team around here. So let me just say up front, I love working for Brian Tome. I totally do. Brian is fun. He's an incredible leader. He's the most entrepreneurial person I've ever worked with. I love his heart for the Lord. I love working for Brian Tome. And you should also know Brian has a specific set of love languages. Anybody familiar with that? The 5 love languages? Yes. Well, Brian has a different set of love languages. I thought I'd share them with you. Number one, this will make perfect sense. This will help you understand him so much more. His number one love language is probably inappropriate humor. That's probably number one on the list. More and more, it's been racial humor with me, which is just, that's Brian's love language. Insults. Insults is another love language that Brian Tome has. Another love language he has is hitting. If anybody knows that, Brian is really good at that. Sometimes they're love taps, sometimes they're not. And also sexual innuendo is actually one of his clear love languages. So if you didn't know that about him, you may not appreciate this next segment, but he will appreciate it a lot. The truth is I love working for Brian, and yet Brian and I are very, very different. We have a picture here just to illustrate some of the differences between me and Brian. So if you haven't been around Crossroads, we do something every year called the Super Bowl of Preaching. And it's awesome. It's a fun weekend where we have, how many people did we have last year for the Super Bowl? 30, 40,000, I don't know, a lot of people. And we have a weekend where we kind of do a preach-off up here, and it's a lot of fun. And so, of course, this is some of the dynamics of it. We wear the jerseys of the teams that are playing in the Super Bowl later that day and have a lot of fun with it. And so, as you look at these pictures, there's just some very clear differences between me and Brian. Some very clear differences. Brian is all suburban Pittsburgh all the time, right? That's Brian. Me, I am straight up Philadelphia urban. That's me. That's just who I am. So, we're different in that way. Brian is all classic rock. He's all classic rock and increasingly country. Now he's definitely got in the country. Me, I'm old school hip hop and R&B. That's just who I am, right? You know, throw a little gospel in there too. That's who I am. And then obviously there's the most clear difference. I mean, you just take a look. I mean, you got a former Presbyterian and a former Pentecostal. I mean, that's a very clear. I mean, that's the one you all saw right away, right? So there's some differences between us, and yet there is a synergy that happens when you have a chance to lead under someone who leads very differently from you. There's a synergy and a richness. There's a growth that can happen in that environment, and it has absolutely happened to me. And I'm not the only person who would say this. You know, visibility-wise, I may be the second most visible person around Crossroads, but I'm certainly not the second most in terms of authority. We have an incredible executive pastor. We have an incredible leadership team, and I slot under all of those folks in the role that I do as campus pastor here in Oakley. And yet, from a visibility standpoint, there's some uniquenesses and some differences there. The truth is, though, I'm not even the first person who's learned the lesson of leading from the second chair. So a lot of what I'm sharing really was taught to me by this guy. This is an old school picture. This goes back quite a ways. This is Brian Tome and Brian Wells. For those of you who were around Crossroads for a while, Brian Wells, one of the founders of Crossroads, he was actually the first teaching pastor. And I'll never forget the day when Brian Wells came into my office to tell me he was leaving for an entrepreneurial venture. So I had been on staff for, I don't know, a couple of months at that point and was doing a very different role. And Brian came into my office one day and he said, hey, I have something I want to tell you. I feel like God is calling me away from what I'm doing at Crossroads to go and make movies and to create what he would call good, great entertainment. And he's been running after that and has had an incredible impact literally all around the world, and it's been awesome to see that happen. And he said, one of the things that made me feel like it was good for me to leave, and it was time for me to leave, and I could leave, was you coming on staff. So how do you feel about being the teaching pastor at Crossroads? And so, of course, I'm like, do I have a choice? Like that, you know, just ask that clarifying question, right? So no, I absolutely wanted to step into that. And so what it did is it created an opportunity and a relationship for me to really learn under Brian in a more focused way. And it's been a powerful, powerful part of my growth experience around Crossroads. And what I've learned, and we've seen this over and over in the conference, what I've learned is there is a power when you just sit in that space of being in the second chair, not being the number one person, but sit in that space and lead from where you are. We heard some examples of this yesterday. I remember yesterday Kirk Perry talking about Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg and the fact that they, through their relationship, have created something at Facebook that didn't exist before she stepped in to that operational role. I go way back in my sports history and think about this guy right here. Michael Jordan was awesome, but he wasn't awesome without Scottie Pippen. Am I right? Just didn't happen, right? And Scottie Pippen was a second chair player, right? He knew his role. He wasn't the leader of the team, but he played his role well, and the Bulls would not have had the success they had without him. And in fact, it was different when he left. And then, you know, this even happens in Intergalactic Struggles. I don't know if you're a Star Wars fan, but I don't know where we would be without the Wookiee, you know? I mean, Han Solo is awesome, but he needed the Wookiee. So I just thought this would be really fun at Unpolished to have all of us do our best Wookiee sound on 3. You guys ready for that? This is a great way to warm up after lunch, too. So 1, 2, 3, do your best Wookiee right now. There you go. Yeah, so in every function, in every role, I see this synergy that happens when you're comfortable leading from the second chair. And one of the Bible verses that shapes this for me, that really helps me step into this, and I believe this is a godly biblical thing, is Romans chapter 12. Verse 3 says this, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them." And I love this verse because it describes the relationship of leadership in the body of Christ, the way that it's supposed to work. And you know what? It may not be a one-for-one connection into your business, but I do think there's some principles here in this passage that help you lead well from the second chair. So all the second chair people in the room, I'm going to give you 4 lessons that I've learned about leading well from the second chair. And the first lesson is this: you need to value the whole more than your part. You need to value the whole more than your part. I love what it says. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. You know what happens oftentimes in organizations where you have an expertise, or you're there because you bring this specific thing to the table. So you may not be the CEO, but you're the chief marketing officer. You may not be the CEO, but you're the accountant. You may not be the CEO, but you're the guy who's thinking about operations. You're the operations manager of the organization. Oftentimes, we can be so focused on our part that we think everything revolves around it. And oftentimes, the conflict in organizations comes from the fact that as people who have a specific role to play, I play a specific role at Crossroads. I lead this campus. That is my specific role. When I'm up here teaching, I am teaching across all campuses. Those are specific roles that I play. But I have to always remember there is a bigger thing God is doing in this thing called Crossroads than just my part. And when I value the whole more than my part, I'm leading at my best. I'm leading at my best. I remember when we went to our multi-site structure, and we decided that we would be one church with multiple locations. Brian sat down with me and all the other campus pastors, and he gave us kind of 3 expectations. And the first one was this: I want you to value the whole of Crossroads more than you value your part. And so what does that look like practically? Well, one of the things I often say is every time we launch a new site at Crossroads, here in Oakley, I hear a huge sucking sound, a huge vacuum sound. Because where do people get trained up in Kids Club and First Impressions and in our ministries to go to other sites and lead well? They get trained up here in Oakley. So every time we launch a new site in Oakley, we face a leadership deficit once again. Literally, when we launch a site, there's probably about 1,500 volunteers, depending on the size of the site, that were in key leadership roles at my campus that go to other campuses to plant that seed. There's 2 ways to look at that, right? You can look at that and say, well, man, I'm never going to be able to get ahead. If we care about people coming in and having a great experience and growing, I need somebody to value my part. We need to figure out another way to launch sites besides taking all of my great volunteers that we raise up. That's one way to look at it. But what I've learned and what I believe the Bible teaches is, what if you look at that and shift it and say, how do I value the whole more than my part? And so what that's looked like for me is, at Oakley, what we say is, we are the soil of the mission of Crossroads. We're soil here. We expect to put seeds in the ground. We expect to have people who come into leadership here, who experience relationship with Jesus for the first time here, and in the midst of their growth here, they are poured on, they are built into, they get air, they get water, they get all the things they need to thrive and grow. And at some point, those seeds are going to be sent to Mason, to Florence, to the West Side, to down to Bogarts, to other sites that we haven't opened yet. And instead of complaining about that, instead of being frustrated about that, every time that happens in Oakley, we celebrate that. We celebrate that because we value the whole more than our part. And what that also means is you have to hold your ideas loosely. You have to hold your ideas loosely. Now, if you're like me and you're wired this way, by the time I actually speak an idea, I'm kind of already in love with my idea. Anybody else like that? Like, I kind of dig this thing that I'm about to say, or else I wouldn't say it, right? And so what does it look like in an environment where you're not the main guy, and ultimately sometimes it's not your call? How do you hold your ideas loosely? How do you hold them loosely and allow them to be shaped and formed by people who have broader perspective or different perspective? That happens when you value the whole more than your part. I love what it also says in this verse, though. If you have gifts, and we all have gifts, it says, let us use them. The second lesson that I've learned from the second chair is you need to deliver your part. You need to deliver your part. One of the things that I have chuckled about oftentimes, I've been at Crossroads, I've been on staff for about 8 years, and so I've been teaching. Even before that, I taught as a volunteer. And so, particularly in the last couple of years, I've had people come up to me often, and they'll say, man, you have grown so much as a communicator. You have really just grown, and it's just exciting to see you grow. And I receive that, and I'm just so thankful because I feel like, that's the work of God in my life. I also chuckle, though, because sometimes when people say that to me, what they're trying to say in a very kind way is, when you started, you were terrible. When you started doing this, now some of you hear me for the first time, and you're like, and I'm waiting for you to get better. So I get that, but believe it or not, I was even worse than I am right now, if you can believe that. And so what I've had to learn through that, though, is there is a journey I've been on in learning how to deliver my part at Crossroads. One of the things I think is unique around here is every communication we have from this stage really is about helping people grow in their relationship with Jesus, and it's also about helping people to move. We are a mobilizing team. We are an entrepreneurial organization that is going after new things. And so I had to grow in my journey of learning, how do I not just help people maybe learn some helpful biblical stuff when I teach, but how do I move our community through this stage? Because that's part of the reason that I'm here. What does that look like? And so it's been a journey of learning how to deliver my part. And I would actually call it the journey of finding my voice, finding my unique voice. And Brian talked about this a couple years ago. He did a podcast, and it was about men artistry. And he talked about how there's a journey that all of us go on as it relates to growing in the thing that God's called us to do. So whether your deal is creative design, or whether your deal is leading organizations, or whether your deal is designing things, product design, engineering, kind of that mind, whether it's working with the numbers and helping organizations figure out how to get funding streams, all of that, whatever it is, there's a journey that you go on in learning how to do that thing well. And it usually begins with imitation. You usually start by finding someone who does it really well, and you kind of just do the things that they do. Right? And for me, I was blessed to be in an environment where I was watching one of the best communicators in the country every week. And so there were a lot of things that I was kind of trying on because I saw Brian do it and it seemed like it worked. And it was an imitation thing. It may not have been uniquely me, but it was what I saw. I knew it worked for him. And so I was trying that on. So you move through imitation, though, and ultimately you get to a place where you start critiquing. You start realizing, you know what, that works for him, but that doesn't work for me. That's not my unique personality. And sometimes critiquing can go negative, and you can actually start to judge, and look at, there's times, this is a place where we can be honest, right? So, there'll be honest some weekends where Brian would preach, and I'm like, I could have totally done better than that on that one. Dang. Really? Really? I could have farted out something that was better than that. So, that happens. So you go through this phase where it's really about critiquing. And then ultimately, what I learned and where I moved beyond that was appreciation of the differences between how God has uniquely gifted Brian as a communicator and how he's uniquely gifted me. And while there's things that he does that would never be the way that I would say it, they'd never be the way that I articulate it, it works for him, and it's him uniquely being who God called him to be as a leader and as a communicator. I move through appreciation, and then you can get to a place of innovation. And I think that's where I am now, is figuring out what are the unique ways that God has called me to communicate and mobilize our community. I still have to deliver my part. But I have to come to a place where I can do it out of uniquely who I am. And ultimately, the goal through that process is you get to a place of impact. You get to a place where when you deliver your part, you're delivering it uniquely the way God has wired you to, whatever that is, whatever role you're in the organization that you're starting or in the organization where you're second chair. You can be the best at what you uniquely do. You bring your part to the table. One of the places where I've really had to grow in this, though, is not only from mobilizing from the stage, but leading through people. One of the reputations that I have, and I think it's not a way off reputation, is I'm like Mr. Nice Guy. Everybody's, oh, Chuck, you're so nice. You're so nice. Well, you know what? A couple years ago, we did a 360-degree leadership assessment, all of the kind of management level folks at Crossroads, just to understand, hey, how can we grow as leaders around here? And one of the things that came back for me over and over again was how my niceness was getting in the way of me leading strong. Because where I was not being clear for the purposes of being nice, that really wasn't helpful leadership. Or where I was unwilling to have difficult conversations because of the purposes of being nice, that really wasn't helping the team that I lead optimize the things that God had called us to. And so I realized I've got to step into a place that feels uncomfortable, but it's my part. One of the reasons that we moved to an environment where Brian is not the senior pastor and the pastor of Oakley is because there's a level of leadership that I need to bring to this campus. And that means not only being the guy that's visible and the guy that's kind of welcoming people to the campus, but also the guy who's having difficult conversations. The guy who's telling people, hey, I don't think this is working out from a staff perspective, and we need to change some things here. And so one of the places that got tested for me was we've done something every year at Crossroads. One of the entrepreneurial things we started. It's called a journey. And so what we do now is in the fall, now in the spring, we'll have a 6-week period where the whole church, kids and everybody gets together, and we focus on one particular topic for 6 weeks, and everything from the stage to a book that everybody has or now an app that everybody has, and small groups are all around this topic. And it's really just a powerful way that God has grown our community and grown our church. And I lead that team. That's one of the things I do from the second chair is I lead the journey. I'm the project leader for that project. So after our last journey some years ago, We get feedback, we assess, Tim talked about evaluation, and we evaluate, hey, what are we seeing? What are we learning? How can we improve? And basically what we were realizing is this thing was really getting stale. This journey, which had been a powerful part of our community, it was really becoming a stale expression, and we needed to change some things. And I looked at that data, and I realized I got to deliver my part. I've got to go to creatives. How many people interact with creatives in here? I've got to go with creatives and tell them what you're creating currently isn't hitting the mark. That's a super easy conversation, right? That's people who've done that, no problem, right? So I had to step into this role of saying, hey, I've got to deliver the hard information. I've got to deliver the difficult information. I've got to deliver my part. Now, the awesome thing is when you're doing that in the context of a team like Crossroads, which is a healthy team, people receive that well. People receive that well, and it was well received. And I think some of the innovation that's happening in the journey right now, anybody who did Brave, the Brave app, that team took that challenge, and man, they ran with it and knocked it out of the park, my humble opinion. I think they crushed it. But that's all a part of me stepping into the unique role I play and delivering my part. You have to deliver your part. You have to value the whole more than your part when you're leading from the second chair, but you have to deliver your part. Third lesson is you have to sharpen and then submit. And I'm talking specifically about your relationship with the leader of the team, your CEO, your boss. You have to sharpen and then submit. Caleb Myers, man, wasn't he awesome earlier today in his talk? Just crushed it. And we were together last night, and I was talking to him about today and kind of what I was going to share, and he was like, you should talk about Joshua. And the story of Joshua is basically, Joshua was the second chair to Moses. So when the nation of Israel was released from Egypt and God was moving in that community, Moses was the leader. He was the point person. He had the vision. He was taking them to the promised land. Joshua, for what we can imagine was about 40 years, was the second chair as Moses was coming along. And it's an interesting story, and Caleb put some insight on this story that I hadn't noticed before. There's a point when they're about to cross into Jericho, and Moses sends some spies to kind of say, hey, what's the lay of the land? He was evaluating. He was figuring out, what is it? We got to navigate our way to this thing. How do we evaluate that? So he sends these 12 spies, and the 12 spies come back, and 10 of the spies say, basically, we are crazy if we try to do this. They're giants in the land. This city is well fortified. They've got giant walls. We can't do this. We will fail. And it says 2 spies had a good report. One of them was Joshua, and the other was Caleb. But the only one who spoke up was Caleb. Caleb said, we can absolutely do this. And Caleb was like, interesting question. Why didn't Joshua speak up? Why didn't Joshua speak up? He was the point person. He was the heir to the throne of Moses. He was the next in command. When Moses went away, Joshua was going to lead. Why didn't he? He said the reason is because it was just understood that wherever Moses was, Joshua was. Wherever Moses' mind was, Joshua was. Joshua was loyal to Moses, and everybody understood that. And what I've had to learn from the second chair is loyalty is the currency of leading from the second chair. Loyalty, and I mean specifically loyalty to your leader. My loyalty to Brian is the currency of leading from the second chair. But there's a tension there, right? There's a tension of sharpening and then submitting. What does sharpening mean? He doesn't need me to be a yes man. He needs me to deliver my part, right? That means I'm going to bring unique perspective to things. That means when we disagree, I need to learn and have had to learn, how do I offer a differing perspective? And we can have those conversations. One of the things that's been happening recently at Crossroads and specifically in me is around this call to racial reconciliation in our city. And as we've navigated through what does that mean for our community, Brian and I have had to have sharpening conversations. We've had to have honest conversations where we get real and we put real things on the table and we come to places where it's like, hey, man, we've got to figure out how to navigate this. I think about when we had an officer that was shot, and there was an interaction. The officer was shot, and the person who did the shooting was also killed. And both of those families had connections to our church. And Brian and I had a conversation about that, and I felt it was really important that he heard my perspective on it, as he was thinking about how do I lead? Because he was up that weekend and he was going to be leading, and we wound up, I think, honoring both parties in that in a helpful way. That was a reconciling move. And it wasn't that he didn't have that heart to do that. He absolutely did. But I knew I could bring a unique perspective as an African American, understanding how that might be perceived, and I could bring that to him. I need to sharpen in that way, and I need to be sharpened by him in that way. However, there has to come a point where I say, I don't have the responsibility you have, and ultimately, you're responsible for the whole, and I've got to submit. So there's been some other things, these are more tactical things where we talked about, hey, well, how do we kind of roll this out, and what are some plans? And, where Brian has disagreed with me, there's times when I can easily take that personally and say, well, man, he's disagreeing with me. Like, this idea is awesome. I love this idea. How could you not see this? And what I have to recognize is, God has given Brian a broader mantle than just the mantle he's given me to pursue racial reconciliation. So I can bring that sharpening to the table. However, when the decision is made, I joyfully submit. I don't always get my way. I don't always win the argument. I don't always get to influence the things that I want to influence, but I will always joyfully submit. You know why? Because that's a biblical principle. That's a biblical principle. Loyalty is the currency of leadership in the second chair. One of the things that we have around here is a document that all of us as staff kind of say, hey, here are the core things we promise to each other. Things are going to change. Vision might shift. We might have things that we're going after that didn't exist, but there are some things that we say relationally we commit to each other. We call it our I promise document, and one of the pieces of it is this. It says, I promise to trust those in authority over me. Even when a decision is made that I don't understand, I will remember that I don't have all the information nor the responsibility and insight that God gives those in leadership. I will commit to not being a burden to authorities in the church so that their job will be a joy. When this happens, I will be blessed. You hear that? When this happens, I will be blessed. What happens when I sharpen, but then when it's time to move forward, I joyfully submit, we lock arms, and we run after the decision that we've made? I'm blessed in that process. Hebrews 13:17 says, obey your leaders and submit to their authority. They keep watch over you as men who must give an account. Obey them so that their work will be a joy, not a burden, for that would be of no advantage to you. No advantage to you. The truth is, when you're leading something, if you're the first chair person here, you're leading something, I know that one of the things you crave and value are people who are loyal to you. They might disagree with tactics. They might disagree with strategies. You might have vigorous debates about these things. These might be long-time debates. But when they're loyal to you, you'll go to war with them. Am I right? You'll go to war with them. And that's what every senior leader needs, and I'm committed to be that. And I'm blessed in the process of that. So value the whole more than your part, but deliver your part. Sharpen thinking, bring your unique perspective, and then joyfully submit. And then the final thing is bloom where you're planted. Bloom where you're planted. For some of us in here, this is a frustrating talk because you really think you can do it better than the number one guy. You really do. And maybe someday you'll be stepping into that leadership role. But I tell you what, I think Joshua learned this. I certainly have learned this. I think this is true for people who lead well from the second chair. When you bloom where you are planted, you are better positioned to bloom where God might take you next. When you bloom where you're planted. One of the scriptures that we've shared a couple times around here is Colossians 4:17. It says, see that you fulfill the ministry that you have received in the Lord. The truth is we don't all have the same ministry. Brian has a unique ministry. I have a unique ministry. But when I fulfill my ministry, when I bloom where I'm planted, the organization gets the best. And the cool thing for me is I've just said, hey, I'm going to do that. I've gotten to be a part of more entrepreneurial ventures around here than I could have ever imagined. I've traveled to India, I've traveled to South Africa, I've traveled to Israel. I've gotten to be a part of this thing called The Journey that now has expanded and has sometimes up to 55 churches around the country doing it with us. I've gotten to be a part of incredible experiences leading a site here in Oakley. Never thought that would be something that I did. And now I'm getting to pursue this call that God has on my life to be a reconciler and to have an impact in the city. All of those things happen, I believe, because I'm a part of this team. And if I was trying to do this on my own, I would not be getting the benefits that I'm getting now. It has been a blessing to lead from the second chair. It's the best environment for entrepreneurship that I've found. And so I want to encourage you guys with the words of Romans 12. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned, each according to the gifts that God has assigned to you. For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ. You're one team with the people you're running after your entrepreneurial venture with, and individually members of one another. So, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. Let us use them. One of the stories I love to share about the power of leading from the second chair is a moment in our nation's history that is deeply meaningful to me and deeply memorable to all of us. And it's the March on Washington during the Civil Rights Movement. And of course, when we think about that day, we think about Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. You know, I don't know if you ever thought about it this way, but the Civil Rights Movement really was an entrepreneurial venture. I mean, it was something that had never been done before. It was a bootstrap operation. It had all the challenges that any startup would experience around personnel and funding. And then they had some other issues that you may not deal with, which is like, what we're doing is currently illegal. How do we navigate that? Hopefully you're not dealing with that. Don't do anything illegal. If you don't take anything away from Unpolished, don't start a business that's illegal. Don't do that. That was worth the price of your admission right there. But anyway, you know, like, this was an entrepreneurial venture, and it was not a one-man show. And maybe some of you know the backstory on the "I Have a Dream" speech. The truth is, that day, Martin Luther King did not get up to give the "I Have a Dream" speech. He had a very different speech in mind, and in fact was down that path. But Mahalia Jackson was a second-chair leader in the movement. In many ways, she was the voice of the music of the movement. That was her. And while Martin Luther King was standing up there beginning his speech, only a couple people heard this, but Mahalia Jackson yells out to Martin Luther King from the stage, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And in that moment, Martin Luther King set aside the prepared notes that he had, and he gave a speech that, quite frankly, changed the trajectory of a movement. It changed my life personally, and I would argue it has changed the fabric of our country. And that was leadership from the second chair. So here's my challenge to you. If you are a first chair visionary leader, if you have a vision, tell us about your dream. We need to hear your dream. We need you dreaming. We need you out front. We need you challenging the status quo. We need that. And if you're in here and you're a second chair leader and you work for someone like that, you need to value the whole more than your part. But you need to deliver your part. You need to sharpen and submit. And you need to bloom where you're planted so that that dream can thrive. Thank you, guys. Enjoy the rest of the day.